It's been a while. My apologies for not for not posting an episode sooner. I've been busy, but today, as a really sort of profoundly significant way of rehashing the episodes and getting more content out, I am joined once again by friend of the podcast, Curtis Murphy. Curtis got in touch with me literally a couple of days ago to talk about his new project, which is, it's called Smoke and Spirit. The Wound Contains the Medicine. It's something that's very, very dear to my own heart. If you're in any way a listener of the podcast, you'll know that I absolutely love tobacco, and my relationship with tobacco has been, in the understatement of the century, fraught. But thankfully, what Curtis is here to talk about today is a framework for healing individual and collective relationships with tobacco, which I am so excited about. And the approach to that, which, as he will describe soon, involves a ritual logic and animist ethics approach to the plant and its history. And I love it. I love it 1,000%. I could talk about it forever, but thankfully we have the expert himself. Welcome back, Curtis. How are you, mate?
Hey, good to be here. Good to be here. And I mean, I am anything but an expert on on tobacco or any but I'm a plant enthusiast and someone who's worked with tobacco for a while, in a mostly what I like to think of as a fairly conscious way. It's kind of come about, and just over a number of years, I've been kind of tracking and tracing the history of tobacco, the culture of it, the rituals surrounding, kind of the unconscious rituals surrounding contemporary tobacco use and tobacco culture, and how those kind of mirror and are a shadow of the deeper historical and spiritual rituals that surround tobacco. And I've come to some kind of understanding that basically tobacco has never stopped being a ritual substance. It's just become an unconscious ritual relationship that is more detrimental to the people participating in the ritual rather than a blessing and offering and sacrifice. So this idea of returning it to its original status as a form of offering, a form of connection, as a being that we're in relationship with, as a way of healing our individual and collective relationships with that plant. And and that's not like an original idea of mine or anything, but I've never seen it brought out very publicly outside of some very niche programs that some Indigenous groups I know run in Canada, around smoking cessation, but I've never seen it really brought out more widely. And what kind of made it click for me recently was, this idea of healing our relationship with tobacco that way, and marrying it with some things I've been learning in the last couple of years through some of my other work around prescription drug tapering, of how people can safely get off of prescription drugs that they don't want to be on without massive withdrawals and those types of things, and seeing that can be applied to tobacco in the context of this ritual. And so, just to give a slight observation, for years I was mystified. Like, I've never been a serious smoker, interestingly enough, but I have this relationship to and this draw to tobacco. But I've always noticed like cigarette butts everywhere, obviously, right? And people are always complaining and very moralistic. Oh, these smokers, they're leaving their cigarette butts everywhere. And even when there's like a designated butt can or something, still somehow they're all over the ground right beside it. And it's like always very perplexing to me. And one day it hit me. It's like, well, that's an offering. That's people, like, the plant is compelling people to make offerings of it, and by like strewing butts everywhere. That's traditionally how tobacco is given. You take little twists of tobacco and put it places. And you put it in significant places, at the crossroads, under trees, on pathways, by plants that you're harvesting. And so people are unconsciously strewing tobacco offerings everywhere somehow, because my view from an animist perspective is that's what the plant like asks and demands and needs. And even in this corrupt, commodified relationship we have with it, it still demands that and needs that and is hungry for it. And even look at, like, I don't know exactly how it is in Australia or whatever, but here in Canada, like, if you want to buy cigarettes, like, they're at this like designated space behind the counter. They're kind of hidden from view. You have to give ID, obviously, to buy it, which on one hand is just like, that's the legal regulatory framework. But if you see it through a ritual logic, like, that's a ritual in itself. They're in this consecrated place behind the counter, very much like holy relics would be in a consecrated place behind an altar in a church. They're in this like set apart place, and only certain people can go there under certain conditions, right? And then the designated smoking section, the smoking tree outside of the high school, there used to be the smoking section in a restaurant. Like those are key characteristics of ritual use of or ritual of any kind. It happens under specific circumstances with specific people in specific places, and somehow tobacco, in even in contemporary culture, fulfills all of those criteria. And it's just it's just an inversion of the nature of the plant, but in a way that has a very striking logical continuity to it. And seeing that, and just anyway, it's fascinating. And I think once you see it, it's hard to unsee it and see that that's part of this way that, there's some stories from here, on North America, or Turtle Island as it's sometimes called nowadays, that human beings were put on the planet to offer tobacco to the spirits. Like in some traditions, that is literally the purpose of human beings and like why we were created. It's such that like the spirit world needs and demands these offerings of tobacco, such that human beings are just kind of compelled to do it, whether we want to or not, and whether we're going to do it in a reciprocal, respectful way or not. And so anyway, that's kind of like the overall framework, and we can talk about the like hyperbolic tapering stuff after, but that's been something I've been chewing over for many, many years. And anyway, I'll leave it there for now, but yeah.
No, that's like it's fascinating because even those examples that you've got where it's behind a certain, it's in a certain place that only certain people can go to. In a sense, you have to be over a certain age to purchase tobacco, I'm assuming in North America and definitely in Australia. So you have to be initiated.
Yes, right, exactly.
That's
exactly. You have to be initiated, get your card
but
carrying,
even,
yeah.
I mean, even thinking about it that way is a radical departure from the approach that we have in the West towards tobacco, which is, first of all, massive legislative, political, bureaucratic overlays. And you think Canada's bad, mate, you should come down to Australia, where
I'd love to sometime.
we've got this absolutely bizarre relationship with tobacco, particularly now. And so there's that, first of all, that bureaucratic overlay that surrounds the plant. And then you've got the pharmaceutical sort of allopathic medical overlay that surrounds the plant as well. It's just so interesting to take an indigenous or an animist or, a ritualized kind of lens and apply it to tobacco, because just like you said, right, like with some indigenous communities, there's this understanding that humans are just here to offer tobacco, and tobacco has this ritualized kind of place that we see in continuity in indigenous communities first and foremost. But I've always wondered what calls us to the plant. You know what I mean? Like, why tobacco, right? You can understand with weed, for instance, with marijuana, because there's like an immediate, really kind of heavy, sledgehammery kind of payoff on a somatic level. But there are different and other ways with tobacco, particularly in a Western context, to get that same kind of neurological release. And yet we're still compelled to access the plant. So in Australia, we have the plain packaging, which has images of dead babies and people with stomas and stuff.
Yeah.
We led the charge with that in Australia. We were the first country to have that kind of graphic kind of image on the front and the plain packaging, etc. And even with that, like massive sort of governmental push to eradicate tobacco, people have still paid ridiculous amounts of money for legal tobacco. And the way that the legislative framework works in Australia is that tobacco regulation and the enforcement of things like black market tobacco is handled predominantly through health departments as opposed to police departments. Because of the way in which the health department landscape has changed since the pandemic, they have very few resources to police black market tobacco. So you can go into an official church of tobacco, like your supermarket or, any sort of legitimate seller, and you can pay ridiculous money, like $50 for a packet of 20 cigarettes, which is what it is.
That's even more
ridiculous.
Than here. Wow.
Or you can go to any number of tobacconists and get black market tobacco for like $12 for the same packet in a non-plain package, a very openly, illegal kind of tobacco, and it's fucking everywhere, at least here in Melbourne. And so people are still compelled, and there are other ways in which the plant follows us. And so I feel like that relationship is so ingrained, just like you described, in the human experience, that surely there has to be a different way. And that's why I'm so super excited to hear about the project and the ways in which approaching it from a ritual perspective is going to, offer a different insight, but also importantly, offer a different way of approaching the relationship with tobacco fundamentally. So talk me through the animist ethics around it. Like, what's the approach of the project with how we relate to the plant?
Sure, sure. I mean, I just want to say one more thing, just briefly on the like kind of political regulatory angle before we segue into that. Is that
Sure.
here in Canada, there's a similar dynamic where like mostly the only place you can get cigarettes is at a convenience store, and but the other place where people get them that's dramatically cheaper is on First Nations reserves. Like this, where that's where you can go to, and there's the tobacco. Like it's one thing, it's a bit quite ironic again, with this ironic logic, like that's the original keepers of tobacco, but now that's one of the only ways they can make and any income is by selling cigarettes. And it's sort of, as I understand it, like pseudo legal. Like most of it is not quite legal. Like the sale of it is legal, but the origin is not totally clear, and they're insanely cheap, like giant cartons of it for, I don't know, $10 or whatever, so um and but so there's this real irony there as well. And the other cuts, that's kind of what I mean about like, the wound contains the medicine too. Like that's like the original wound of like colonialism and commodification is still playing out. That's where how indigenous people can make a bit of money, and how everyone else can go and get cheap smokes and stay addicted. And meanwhile, the public health angle is just tobacco's evil, it's going to kill you. Like there's this, the plant is the enemy. So if we're going into the animist ethic to start, is like the plant is not the enemy. The plant somehow has maybe become the enemy because we have started a war with it. Maybe that's why the tobacco feels like the enemy, because we started treating it that way. Or at first we started, maybe before we started treating it like the enemy, we started treating it like a conquered um being that we're just going to commodify and use. And I'm just still studying a little bit more about that whole history, but loosely how I understand it is, colonists came to the Americas, and one of the first things they did, was set up these tobacco plantations, and importing slave labor from Africa to run tobacco plantations, and deliberately getting enslaved people addicted to nicotine. And then it became a whole status thing, and it spread to the world, over the course of a couple hundred years, and then people everywhere became addicted to it. And so it's this whole so there's the wound contains the medicine, like individually, of like healing our individual relationship with this plant, and the wound also contains the medicine in the sense that the medicine is at the center of this gaping collective wound of these larger systems, um, of exploitation and commodification that are still going on. And part of the reason why I'm not sure why I feel drawn to this. Like I said, like partly because I'm a plant person and I like plants and relating to plants. And a few years ago, a friend gave me some seeds of the Nicotiana rustica, like the traditional, wild tobacco, and I grew it in the garden and made offerings with it at other places in the garden, and did that for a few years and gave the seeds to friends. And that's just kind of just felt right, felt good. But I live in tobacco country. Like this is where I live. It's like this is the heartland of tobacco. Like historically, even today, like I drive by tobacco fields every time I go into town. Like you can see the tobacco is growing, and there's still the drying sheds where they hang it and cure it. They're still there. And my wife says that 20 years ago when she was a kid, or 30 years ago, I guess, that all the fields were tobacco. That was all it was. Like it's all tobacco. And now most of it's corn and soy, but there's still tobacco fields. And the main street in town, it's actually the street we live on, is called Imperial Road, which is
Whoa.
named after Imperial Tobacco Company, because there was the Imperial Tobacco plant in this little tiny town called Elmer, Ontario, has an Imperial Tobacco plant. That's like was the heart of the local economy, and it's since it went out of they shut down in 2008, and now it's kind of a community like business hub, of which the main tenant is actually a weed company. Interestingly enough, they'll like
Yeah.
pivot to like what people smoke and consume. It's a whole other topic. But so Imperial, like I live at the heart of the tobacco empire, interestingly. And like I find there's so many layers to that. Like I literally live on Imperial Road, and at some point in the 19th 20th century, someone thought imperial tobacco was a good name for tobacco back when empire had like more positive connotations for more people. But to me that just says so much about what tobacco is, how it's tied up with empire and like the empire of tobacco and the idea of humans kind of having like dominion over tobacco, but then actually tobacco kind of having the last laugh of making people sick and addicted, and because that's how we've treated it. So this animist idea, I see it in two ways. There's one lens in which humans have kind of abused tobacco, like tried to take tobacco, use it for our own purposes, and like been very disrespectful, and that tobacco is kind of like the victim of human, industrial, at least the industrialized version of humanity. Tobacco is kind of the victim of this, you know, this, unequal, violent relationship. But there's another lens in which tobacco like doesn't give a shit about us and is like, all right, fine, I'm just gonna kill you all. And because that tobacco, there's this audiobook, I think the authors I forget are escaping me, but Jeremy Narby and another guy. Anyway, it's interviews with like South American shamans around ayahuasca and tobacco, and there's one line from it where he basically says the medicines, the plants, they teach medicine, but they can also teach malice. That the same medicine can, the same plant can teach medicine or teach malice, and it's largely about how you show up to that plant. So we've been on the receiving end of tobacco's malice teachings for a few hundred years, and all the like public health messaging and like it's still playing into that. And granted, like some of it's quite effective, like say smoking rates in Canada have gone down from like almost 50% to about 10% in the last 50 years. So like granted, it sort of works, but there's clearly a hard limit to it. And I think that like this last 10% or whatever, not going to go away without a different shift in how we relate to it. And that being said, like tobacco use has stayed stable or increased in other parts of the world, like, the global south, where there isn't the same regulation. So like actual global tobacco consumption hasn't actually dropped that much at all. Even if per capita use in certain parts of the world is way down, it's the same companies. Imperial Tobacco is still operating all over the world and like pushing cigarettes in Africa and Asia, where it's a status symbol, like it was here, 60 years ago or whatever. And so so those two pieces of the animist ethic, in which we're the like mean humans abusing the innocent plant, and the other angle in which these plants, these medicines are way more powerful than we are, and if we're not going to relate properly, we're going to find ourselves relating anyway, just in a way that is not good for us and that we don't have much say in. So returning to and pivoting back to the proper way of relating to tobacco is a way of healing ourselves, the land, and gets at the healing of this bigger history that is still going on.
That's I mean, look, it's fascinating just the language that we're using, and naturally, like, a lot of the penny drop sort of light bulb moments around, yeah, of course, imperial fucking tobacco. And the other one and the other one is like British American Tobacco is a big company here as well. Yeah. There's a lot of that old world imperial kind of
exactly.
Dynastic sort of language baked into it. And even the fact that, like you can treat tobacco as an enemy and you can wage a war on it. I mean, I'm not at all, unaware of the connotations and the associations of tobacco with the planet Mars as well.
Course, so
in astrology and astromagic, tobacco and Mars are basically best friends, and it's an incredibly martial arrangement. I'm also mindful, this is not a video podcast, but you're wearing a wonderful red shirt today, my friend. Just channeling the Mars thing, right?
Right.
But I mean, there's that kind of martial overlay to it, which is good. And I've heard Mars described as a wonderful servant but a terrible master, and I think that that's an interesting kind of I guess nuance to that whole relationship that we seem to have with tobacco, at least when it's viewed as an instrument of imperialism and an instrument of colonialization, and something that has been sort of abused and fed into an extractive capitalist model, which is the imperial model par excellence. It's just something that kind of, I can go in 10,000 different directions, Curtis, I swear. Because myself, I'm an ex-smoker, or the way I like to describe it is I'm a smoker who doesn't currently smoke. And I managed after 30 years, right, to give up smoking. I traced it back, and I first started when Saturn was in Aries, funnily enough, and Mars ruled sky. 30 years ago, at the age of like 12 or 11, I started punching darts. And, 30 years later, I've managed to get away from it. But when I think about the nature of that relationship, except in very, very limited contexts, which were in and of themselves heavily, related to Indigenous ritual practices, I've abused tobacco. Like, I've absolutely gone hell for leather abusing tobacco for 30 years. And so now I can barely even be in the same room as it. It's such a radioactive substance to me that I have to keep some distance from that plant for a while. But it was deeply important to me, a huge part of my identity. Basically, just, during all of my developmental phase through my teens and early 20s, there was so much tobacco smoke around me that it's fused into my DNA, basically, and been such a huge part of my life. And so when I think about what a relationship with tobacco might look like moving forward, the one thing that sort of settles with me is it has to be very, very cautious and very respectful, first and foremost, to the plant and the power of the plant. Because just like you say, the plant's so fucking powerful. It's so much more powerful than colonialism, capitalism, and any sort of human effort, combined. And I think a program such as yours, which has that ritual approach, which is couched in respect for the plant and the spirit of the plant, is one way that you could potentially not so much eradicate tobacco use, but put it in its proper place, mate. You know what I mean?
Yeah, so that's exactly the idea of that. If you're a smoker or consume tobacco in any form, you're in a relationship with the plant, and you presumably are in a relationship that you don't want to be in. At least most people come to that realization at some point, and it doesn't seem to be an easy way out. And if people, I support and endorse any ways that people can change that relationship. So people, you go cold turkey and it works out great. Use patches and get off, great. Like whatever kind of works. But I think there's maybe a subset of people for who's there's this sense of like wanting to be in a relationship with tobacco, or like you said, that there's meaning in it too. It's not, and I think this is partly what a lot of the dominant framing misses. It's not just this like bad thing to stop. Even it may be that, but that part of the reason it's so hard to stop, like, yes, of course, like nicotine is binding to the receptors in your brain and it's dopamine feedback loop, like, yes, that's one lens on it. But the other lens is there's this, that people kind of want to relate to it, that tobacco is magnetic to human beings, and there's a natural draw to be in relationship with it. So it becomes like, how can we choose what that can look like? And that if we go with the idea that contemporary and like modern industrial tobacco culture is like an inversion or a shadow version of the proper ritual way, then it's like everyone who's a smoker is a carrier of tobacco medicine, a potential carrier of tobacco medicine. And that whether you like it or not, or think of it that way or not, every time you're smoking a cigarette, you're making an offering. And to start doing that consciously, so the kind of loose framework that I'm working in of thinking about how this framework can help people who want to stop smoking and change their relationship with tobacco, the first shift that you'd make is simply do everything you're doing, but do it consciously. Do it when you smoke a cigarette. This is now an offering. It always has been. It always has been an offering. Like this quote from Carl Jung that whatever you whatever you don't make conscious will direct your life, and you'll call it fate, right? And this sense of being fated to be a smoker or being stuck. So like once he becomes conscious, every cigarette becomes an offering. Then when you butt it out, again, I was always surprised how many people would, but cigarette, again, they're expensive and people are butting them out with like 25-30% of cigarette unsmoked and tossing it away. I'm like, dude, you just spent $20 on a pack of cigarette and threw $5 away. But again, that's an offering. So like doing that consciously, butt out the cigarette and then take what's left, put it under a tree, make that an offering. And to start off with, like, that's all there is to do for the first bit. And then we can bring in this idea of hyperbolic tapering, which I think is really, I'm surprised that no one has, as far as I know, no one has applied this to tobacco before. And I think it's partly because tobacco is seen as this like evil thing that you should stop smoking yesterday. So there's no any notion of like gradual, slow. It's just like, no, you got to stop now, which is fine if you can, but most people can, or it doesn't work. And so they're like trying to stop yesterday for 5 years, and instead of taking a year to slowly taper off. And this is, so I've been learning. I'm working with a nonprofit that helps people get information and make more informed choices around specifically psychiatric drugs, and how to taper off ones that you don't want to be on. And basically, in a nutshell, the issue why that's important is that anytime you're taking a drug of any kind for a long time, the body and the brain become heavily adapted to the presence of that drug, such that when you remove it suddenly, it creates chaos in the body. Even if that drug itself is, quote, bad for you, it's when you take away something that's, quote, bad for you, and suddenly you just be totally screwed up. And this happened, like, it's a massive problem that people are trying to stop pharmaceuticals that they don't want to be on, and then have horrible withdrawal symptoms and just, like, quote, supposed relapses of whatever things they're experiencing before that are actually withdrawals from the drug. And so there's this whole wisdom that's been developed in decades in the layperson withdrawal community of something called hyperbolic tapering, which is a slow taper. And the most basic framework is that you taper by 10% of your dose at a time. So it's 10% every 2 weeks, and that's a, could be 5%, could be 2%. It's the rate isn't important, but the important is that it's not a lot. And that what makes it hyperbolic is that it's a percentage of the current dose, not the original dose. And such that you're starting off, say a cigarette has 10 grams of tobacco in it. Like, that's usually they're a bit less, but say it has, 1 gram. Well, anyway, usually let me come up with let's just say it's 100, whatever. Like,
10 grams in a cigarette's like a gorilla finger.
Yeah. Like, so it's like one 1 gram. But anyway, so let's say as a percentage. So you start with 100%, and if you were to taper linearly, you go from 100% to 90% to 80% to 70%, 60, all the way down to 10, and then 0. But if you taper hyperbolically, you go from 100% to 90%, and then you take 10% of 90%, which is, then you get to 81, and then you take 10% of 81, which is like 72 point something. And then gradually, when you're at 50, a 10% reduction is not 10. If 10% reduction is 5. So, and then and the idea that the lower you go, the more significant those things become. And so you're always tapering by a percentage of your current dose rather than a percentage of your original dose. And this is, like, super important. Very few people understand this, that because your body gets used to whatever dose you're on currently. Your body doesn't care what you did a year ago. Your body is adapted to what you're doing now. So, and it's, again, especially as you get down lower, some of these nicotine patches, like typical nicotine patches, like, they're billed as like a gradual thing, and it's like more gradual than just stopping. But again, they go from, I think it's the typical one is like 21 milligrams of nicotine. The next one is 14 milligrams. The next one is 7, and then it's 0. And it seems gradual if you think, but it's actually kind of crazy. And there's reasons why it doesn't work for a lot of people, because actually, when you go from 21 to 17, that's like a 33% drop. When you go from, to 14, when you go from 14 to 7, that's a 50% drop and then when you go from 7 to 0, it's a 100% drop, and creates chaos in the body. And so people's bodies start freaking out, and then people go back to smoking. Like, this is simple as that. And that, there's this myth out there, which I think is a really powerful but a very distorted myth, that, that the half-life of nicotine is only so long, so after 3 to 5 days it's out of your system, and everything else is just psychological. Like nothing could be further from the truth. And it's in the same way as saying, like, it's like, a flood comes through or a tornado comes through and blows down everyone's houses, and the tornado's gone. They say, no, all the damage is just psychological. No, like, the tornado is gone, but the effects of it are very, very real. And that's what's going on kind of just in the biomechanics of it in someone's body, of the addiction to nicotine. So this gentler approach is actually super, super crucial, and I think can offer, and it's worked very well. It's proven itself over decades in the pharmaceutical withdrawal communities, but I've never seen it applied to nicotine. And again, because I think this is idea, get that stuff out of your system now, instead of like, but basically, if you were to take a hyperbolic approach and you were to taper 10% of 10% every 2 weeks over the course of a year, you'd be at like 3% of your original dose after a year, with potentially no crazy withdrawals. And the framework that I'm proposing is that basically, as you kind of taper off of the nicotine addiction, you taper on to offering. And so the idea that, like, so you start off by offering 10% of your cigarette, the tobacco goes into the tree, and then eventually it's 20% of your cigarette, and then at the end you're smoking maybe you're hand rolling something with a sprinkle of tobacco, and the rest is mullein and sage and lavender, and you can kind of keep that ritual aspect of it, but do it more and more consciously, and you're decreasing your consumption of tobacco, and you're increasing your offering of tobacco. And there's lots of different ways that I think people can play around with it, and this is what I want to experiment with people, to try this kind of thing. And because there's a lot of different ways that it can be done, and depending on a person's individual smoking habits and stuff. But I want to speak to I think the subset is probably a pretty small. There's like a billion smokers in the world. It's crazy, but small subset of those people who would vibe with this animist ethic and ritual logic, but are stuck in a relationship with tobacco that they don't want to be in, and to offer a way that is both true, I think, true to the living nature of the plant and the history of the plant, and also gentle on the nervous system is super important too. This this whole like punishing yourself for being an addict to tobacco by going through these crazy withdrawals. That's, and again, depends on the person. Some people are fine and that's great. Some people quit tobacco and start binging on sugar instead, and and then some people just can't stop. And I think it doesn't have to be like that. It doesn't have to be like that. So, yeah, that's why I want to bring this kind of framework, because I think that the plant is ready for it, and we can be in a different kind of relationship.
Well, I think, initially, yeah, there'll be a small subset of smokers who immediately either have a pre-existing animus framework that they can slip into in their relationship with tobacco directly. But I actually think that everyone eventually is going to find a ritualistic, animist kind of approach to healing that relationship with tobacco far more useful than some
Yes.
of the pharmaceutical interventions. So, look, without going into details, if you name a smoking cessation method, I have tried it over the course of the past 3 decades. The thing that works for me is nicotine replacement. And so right now, and I'm about probably 2 or 3 months without a cigarette, it's these little micro lozenges that contain about 4 milligrams of nicotine. I just stick one, between my gum and my cheek, and it slowly leaches into my bloodstream, and it helps with the withdrawal symptoms. But literally any other approach to tobacco, I've tried it. Acupuncture, hypnosis. I did have a very, very powerful but ultimately unsuccessful shamanic healing session with a shaman by the name of Paul Goodwin. He's gone through the Four Winds training school, so he has an Alberto Violdo approach to that relationship. And I found that fascinating, but at the time, not terribly successful. I probably would have needed several sessions for that. But even with the SSRI approach to treating tobacco addiction with products that their brand names here are Champix and Zyban
Right. Yeah.
and
Those have
things
their
like
own
that,
problems.
they're
Yeah.
fucked. They're
Yeah. Yeah.
they're
Well,
so bad. Like my
yeah. Well, don't
experience
even
with
get me
that.
started, right, on that. Of
Oh,
like, well,
mate.
let's get you addicted to something that we own instead of something that someone else owns, right? Like,
Well, yeah,
um,
it's more about
yeah.
just let's throw you into a deep, dark hole of instant and bone crushing depression for no reason. So
Mm,
I took it for a while and was just
right.
bursting into tears at the
Oh
sound of,
yeah.
the
Yeah.
sound of my daughter's voice or a lovely piece of music. I just was not able to regulate my emotions, and I was still smoking as well. So none of it seemed to work. And most recently, the thing that got me over the hill was just um, a massive run of sickness. I think my relationship with tobacco became so toxic and so abusive on my part that it started to push back, and I was violently ill for a couple of months there with, COVID and influenza and all sorts of upper respiratory tract infections. And it was enough to get me out of that abusive relationship. But when I think about the possibility of moving forward with nicotine and with tobacco generally, it's not so much a hyperbolic approach, but definitely the tapering off rather than the immediate cessation is what's been successful for me in the past. But at the same time, I don't, in a perfect world, right? My perfect scenario, Curtis, is that I have a cigarette at an opportune moment because the entire thing was massively ritualized for me. Everyone has their rituals around tobacco. Mine was a coffee and a cigarette, black coffee, espresso, no sugar, cigarette. You give me one of those, I'll do it whatever you want, basically. Like that was my ritual, right? But putting myself in situations where there's an offering component to it, putting myself in situations where the act has a deeper spiritual meaning, a lot of people are going to vibe with that, man, right? Like, and I think starting off with an approach that incorporates people who are already, hip to the animus kind of vibe, that's great. But sooner or later, the only way that we're going to change this like globally abusive relationship to tobacco is to re-ritualize it and to put it back into its appropriate place, which I think is, worthy of respect and also quite powerful. So we've definitely covered off, and everyone's aware of the demonic aspects of the demon weed, but there's definitely medicinal in there. And so, what benefits can people get from an appropriate relationship with tobacco? Like, what's the payoff, mate?
That's a really good question. I mean, like a payoff. I mean, I probably haven't thought about that, as much as I maybe need to. But I think the immediate payoff is, I mean, the relationship itself is the payoff, that you have a powerful spirit ally that I believe tobacco is meant to be. That tobacco is meant to be a a bridge between the human world and the spirit world. That's like, that's not. There's probably more to it than that, but that's a main function of tobacco. Like historically, like any kind of any kind of agreement or ritual or something like a um significant kind of negotiation is tobacco is part of the ritual, right? And like traditionally, indigenous people in North America, anytime harvesting medicinal herbs, you offer some tobacco because the tobacco helps kind of introduce you to the spirit of the other plant, and like tobacco is the messenger between the human world and the spirit world, and it can be offered to ancestors. So I think that's the biggest payoff, is that you have a just think about how powerful and destructive tobacco can be, and now it's on your side. What can you do with that? I don't know. Like I have a feeling individually that it benefits me. I couldn't quantify it for you, but I feel like when I offer tobacco, I offer to the lake here. Um, we have the tree here. We tap for maple syrup. I offer tobacco to under the to the tree, and that feeds that sense of reciprocity. Put it in the lake when you go swimming, just a little bit, and again, that's just a tradition. It's a currency. It's traditional currency between the human world and the spirit world. So you want the spirits to be more friendly to you, offer them some tobacco. You want the land where you live to be more friendly to you, offer some tobacco. You want your medicinal herbs to have more pop, offer some tobacco. Like that's very kind of uh what's the word? That's a very kind of coarse way of looking at it. I think there's a great more subtleties to it, which you'd have to talk to a trained shaman of some kind to get this stuff a little more. But I think that's the basic idea of it. Um, and yeah, I think just having a powerful plant ally is really important. And I do think you're right what you said, that initially there's kind of this small subset of smokers who'd be interested in that, but the bigger thing is like normalizing an animist way of relating to tobacco that I think can start to help people make sense of this, and make sense of why so many people get hooked on it. And then maybe hopefully it starts seeping into the health messaging, and realizing that we don't have to demonize this plant. Like when we demonize the plant, we're seeing our own reflection in it, and we're seeing the reflection of our own experience with it, and so it feels true, but it doesn't have to be the truth. um and I also think what you said about the micro lozenges is super interesting, because that does align with this. You said it's not strictly like the whole hyperbolic tapering thing. You can get a bit overly mathematical to it, but just the basic principle of like you're spreading out instead of getting this big hit. Because this is another thing. People try and quit smoking, and say you're smoking 20 cigarettes a day, right? You could probably just go down. A lot of people could go from 20 to 15 just with a little bit of awareness and not doing a lot that differently, right? But then you start trying to get below 10 or something, or whatever it is for you, and then you're these massive like peaks and valleys. You're just trying to stretch it out, and then you're trying to have only 5 cigarettes a day, and then you're going hours with nothing, and then this massive hit of nicotine. So this idea of whether it's a micro lozenge or a hand rolled cigarette that's only 10% tobacco, having those more consistently throughout the day, your nervous system's on a much more even keel. And that's super important, because not only is it more effective, but then you also get to experience the plant as not so much of an enemy. Because whether you're smoking a ton of it and getting sick, or you're trying to stop and you're feeling intense withdrawals and cravings, and you're white knuckling it all day, you're experiencing yourself as in a battle with this plant, which you are, but you don't have to be, is kind of the message of this. You don't have to be. None of this has to be like this. None of this is inherent in the plant, except that this is how it is when you treat it like an enemy and relate unconsciously. It will be like this, but it doesn't have to be.
Well, I think it's also indicative of that kind of Western materialist mindset that we see tobacco as an isolated plant. Whereas my understanding, just even based on Australian Indigenous communities, which actually don't have tobacco is not native to Australia, and so there's not that same relationship to tobacco amongst our Indigenous peoples. But when it comes to plant allies, everything's always in relationship to everything else. And so when you mentioned like a hand-rolled cigarette with 10% tobacco and maybe like a mixture of sage and mullein and and lavender, there are allies to yourself and allies and friends of tobacco that can help you reroute that relationship too. And I believe that's also part of the approach of the program. Is that right?
Yeah, so that the idea that if you can, yeah, you bring in exactly like mullein and sage, that those are herbal allies on their own, and like mullein, maybe I'm pronouncing it wrong. Only mullein, mullein. I've heard it pronounced a few different ways, but anyway, whatever. The plant, it grows all around here, and it's traditionally used in it interestingly, like it's a medicine for the lungs, and smoking is traditionally one of the main methods of delivery for like lung issues is to smoke and inhale mullein, like, and it's medicine for earaches and everything like that too. So when you and it's in a lot of traditional smoking mixtures, so you mix that in with tobacco, and they kind of cooperate and synergize exactly. So you have another plant ally that's creating this bridge between you and tobacco, and you start to see there's this whole ecosystem of relationships that's actually already all around us. Oh, look, what do I have? Oh, I have sage and lavender in the garden. Oh, the mullein is growing on the beach. Oh, there's tobacco here. There's like, and like it's all right there. Like that's like the beauty of this is just that like everything is already right there. Like, why do we have to somehow create this big problem that like this that again the wound contains the medicine, like the solutions are right there. They're in your garden, or they could be, or they're in your neighbor's garden, or they might be growing in the park down the street, and the medicine is available. And then so imagine like, so you can take a little bit of tobacco and you can go and offer it to that plant, and then you harvest a bit of that plant and put it in your smoking mixture, and then that becomes this like virtuous cycle that can unravel, you know unravel whatever, like, because and this brings back to the initial question, like, why did we start smoking in the first place? Like, just trauma, like individual and collective trauma. So like, why are people even using this substance in the first place, and like, why is it disproportionately like poor people, marginalized communities, like stressed out teenagers? Like, because it kind of works. It is a medicine in that sense. Like, it's a medicine, or like a pharmacon in that sense, of the
Oh,
that's a drug, medicine, and poison at the same. It's the same plant. It's all about how we use it, how we relate to it. So like that like the tobacco is kind of like soothing this trauma or this dysregulated nervous system, but then in time creates more of the same. And then when you try and quit abruptly, you're experiencing that same flood of discomfort that is rooted in massive collective problems as they're embodied in each individual person. And so just finding like just a gentler way of being with ourselves and with the plants, and just like loving tobacco and loving yourself and like being nice to yourself. Like, what an idea. Like, again, I feel like so much of this to the rhetoric of trying to quit tobacco, it's so punishing. And I've always felt this. Again, I've never been a regular smoker, but I've always felt like I was down with like not smoking in the restaurant all the time. But at some point it got to be ridiculous. No smoking within 20 meters of this doorway, and just like heavy, like the smoker as like the social outcast. There's always just I feel a bit heavy handed and unnecessary, even if it sort of works. So like bringing love and gentleness back into this relationship that we have with the plant and with ourselves and with each other is really worthwhile, for its own sake.
well, I mean, first of all, I'm mindful that Mars has just ingressed into Libra, while, like, I think today or yesterday,
Oh,
which is traditionally a difficult place for Mars. But it's interesting that we're just talking about relationships with tobacco, relationships with the Marshall plant, and the ways that you can approach that and the benefits that can come from that. So it's just a little astrological kind of aside for people playing along at home. But I think that when it comes to, the gentleness and the way in which you can kind of recalibrate that, a lot of the negativity surrounded by tobacco use and all of the ways in which social outcast and the stench and the fact that, at least in Australia, you've got to duck down an alleyway, which is usually a putrid place, just to have a cigarette. And the legislation around where you can and can't smoke, I think, is all indicative of that abusive relationship and what happens when you push it too far and when you ask too much. Personally, I like mugwort as a thing, but I'm reminded of the whole. You always find nettle growing, and you always find dock growing close to one another, and so the antidote is always close to the
right,
poison,
right. Of
so to
course, yeah. Same
speak.
as like jewel weed and poison ivies here is the kind of thing. Yeah, exactly. Yeah.
Yeah, it's just an interesting thing, and like with nettle, which is itself quite a martial plant, stinging nettle, it's one of the most nutritionally complete foods you can get. It's like
If you
more.
know how to handle it and you know how to relate to it. Like the one time I thought be smart and put nettle in lasagna, and I didn't like wilt it properly, and my wife is like, "Why is my mouth burning?" It's just like that's sorry, that was the Marshall plant. I didn't, but that yeah,
Yeah, yeah. Look, we've all
yeah.
got stories from our youth. Nettle sort of grows a lot in farming areas around here, and I remember sort of getting some on my hands, and then I needed to take a piss, and you know where that went. You know,
Oh no.
very very martial there. But I think that in terms of what that sort of allegory can kind of teach us is that there's this kind of hyper nutritional component, and just to think about tobacco as a pharmacon. I love the word pharmacon, by the way. The Greek root of it is medicine and poison, but there's also an additional overlay with adjacent Greek words that describe spells, magic, and sorcery. And just thinking about tobacco as that bridge between the human world and the spirit world, and my experience of having a cigarette after a couple of days really without one, it's about kind of just taking yourself out of a context that's deeply stressful. So usually you isolate yourself, and then bang, the head spins kind of spin you off into this context that reminds you that whatever is immediately stressful is kind of meaningless, and the eternal kind of transcendent truth is beyond whatever stressful factors you're experiencing. That could be a way of approaching the phenomenon of tobacco use amongst marginalized people, tobacco use amongst stressed out people, and the way in which that medicine is trying to get to us, but the way we're approaching to it isn't quite so polite. And as a result, we get the negative connotations with that. Um, so look, I mean, right now, for me personally, tobacco is still. I need some time away. We're on a break
Yeah, yeah,
at the
yeah, yeah.
moment.
Legit.
Me and tobacco are on a break. We've had a pretty, Sid and Nancy relationship for 30 years, and it's not amazing, but like the ideal would be to return to a ritualized use of tobacco. And I think when I'm ready, I'm going to get in touch and get into this program with you. Because those instances where I have had exposure to indigenous practices surrounding tobacco have been profound. And so, as a practicer, as an occult practitioner, and an astrological magician, that's something that I'd like to reintroduce slowly but surely. But I think for the short term, at least, I need to kind of just take a break. But I don't think I ever want to be away from tobacco. I just like to have that relationship healed. And with that in mind, 10,000% I'm going with your program when the time comes. So how can people what's going on with it, mate? How can people get involved? What's the approach?
Yeah. Well, I mean, first of all, I'll just say, yeah, like, it's definitely people can change their relationship in a lot of different ways. I'm not here to be like, oh, you quit smoking 6 months ago. Why don't you start smoking mindfully and taper hyperbolically? All right, that's pretty, But and the idea that most, a great deal of traditional tobacco use, if it's if there's it's the kind of Bill Clinton approach of partaking but not inhaling, um, that generally it's not inhaled or minimally inhaled or offered in smokeless ways too. So I think that's a key component that for someone like yourself, you could very easily return to a mindful, conscious relationship with tobacco without ever inhaling any smoke ever again, and like that might be the best thing, and so I think anyway, so I support all ways that people shift that relationship. But I've just started this up. I'm looking for people to do kind of basically a beta trial of this kind of approach, because again, I haven't seen it applied practically, like this idea of tobacco as a being, and that we can relate to in an animistic framework. It's that exists in the world, but it's very much at odds with most of the ways that people are invited to stop smoking. So what I want to do, I want to gather say 10 people or so to try this with me, to do this hyperbolic tapering combined with a ritual, reintroducing a ritual relationship with tobacco. And people can contact me at smokeandspirit@protonmail.com. I'm gonna have a little web page up soon, but for now, yeah, smokeandspirit@protonmail.com. And I want to start this in September, get a few people to just try this out and get some real world data, so to speak. Get a small cohort of people who want to do this, who are ready to shift their relationship with tobacco in this way, and the perks of being part of it, I mean, it's going to be offered for free. I'm not charging any money for this. At this point, I want people to who want to learn, want to help kind of refine this approach with me. And the perks would be that you get to heal your relationship with tobacco and be part of something that's going to help other people heal their relationship with tobacco and maybe contribute to a snowball effect of reintroducing this framework to the masses, and
Yeah.
in a way that I think is powerful. And as you said, it feels like almost inevitable. Like sooner or later, like people have got to get this. It's not that complicated once we really like stop and think about it, and once we can see through the fear mongering and the the commodification. It's right there. It's right there. So
Perfect. All right. So, I'm going to get this episode out like ASAP, and it'll go out to literally tens of people, Curtis, but most of them are going to be in Australia. So let's just quickly kind of address the concerns around geographical distance. Is this going to be conducted online via Zoom? Can anyone anywhere join
anyone
in?
everywhere can and should join. It's going to be probably just with like a Telegram group or something, and we'll maybe have a few live Zoom calls, but mostly the Telegram group, a few videos, and again, we're going to iterate as we go, but creating opportunities for people to connect with each other, to develop shared rituals, and have that kind of social support, because as we know, like the social factor is a huge part in relationship with tobacco too, that like smoking is such a collective ritual already, so let's create different collective rituals, and let's get a group of people who change their relationship with tobacco together, and create a different type of ritual container than the ones that they're currently participating in around tobacco.
Perfect, mate. Well, look, I'll get the email address into the show notes, and I'll make sure that people are aware of it as much as I possibly can. And I'm so fucking keen to hear how this goes, man. I'm going to get you back in a year or so, and we'll talk about it some more. But in the meantime, thank you so much, Curtis. It was great to see you again, buddy. And yeah, let's fucking see where this goes. I'm so excited.
Yeah, thanks a lot, Matt. It's been a lot of fun. Thanks for listening.